Welcome to the Social Movements Lab. My name is Michael Hardt. I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm co-host together with Sandro Mezzadra, who's in Bologna, Italy. I'd like to thank our those who've housed the lab in the past. We started this lab, Sandro and I, 3 years ago, and it worked for 3 years within the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University in conjunction with the University of Bologna. This year, in the last month, Sandro and I have tried to transform the lab into something less academic, more public, and we're very grateful to Red May for the co-sponsorship of the lab. If you're interested in these kinds of events, by the way, you might check out Red May's website and Red May's YouTube channel for similar events. We're also grateful to the media partners, Dinamopress and EuroNomade in Italy, for organizing publicity for the event. Before we get started with today's event, in fact, I think Sandro would start just with mention about the anniversary, and then I'll introduce today's speakers, and we'll get started with the event. Sandro? You're still muted, I think.
Thank you, Michael. Our topic today is the 2019 uprising in Lebanon, and we will be very focused on that topic. In the tradition of the lab, we are very interested in connections, genealogical connections, transversal connections within movements, and international connections. So from this point of view, just a couple of words to introduce our event with a bit of contextualization. And the contextualization is necessarily double. On the one hand, there is a need to remember that the November uprising in Lebanon was part of a huge multiplication of uprisings in different parts of the world in 2019. Latin America, Ecuador, and then Chile, Hong Kong, Iraq, the Iraq movement in Algeria. And this cycle of protests has spurred a lively debate on a new politics of uprisings just before the pandemic. I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. But then there is also something else. Precisely today, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia. And that self-immolation gave rise to a movement that shook the Maghreb and the Mashrek, the Arabic world. Today, we remember what happened in Libya, in Syria after 2011, what happened in Egypt. But in any case, I think that 2011 was a very important moment of insurgent politics that produced effects well beyond the Arabic world. Just think of the Indignados movement in Spain, and then Occupy Wall Street in the US, but also similar movements elsewhere. This is just to give a couple of hints regarding the kind of context of our discussion tonight.
That's terrific. And one other maybe pause before we start, which is that our next lab conversation will be the 14th of January, Thursday, again at 12 noon Eastern US time. 14th of January, about contemporary struggles regarding schools and universities. We're going to be talking with Maddalena Franito in Italy. Also joining the conversation will be Heather Gottney in the US, and probably there will be others. But that will be the 14th of January, yes, about schools and universities, those contemporary struggles. So for today's discussion about the contemporary protests and politics in Lebanon, as we've done the last few times, the first half hour, Sandro and I will construct a dialogue, and today with Karim Makdisi in Beirut. And then the second half hour will join the discussion, Ruba Salih in London and Amy Austin Holmes in Washington. As Sandro mentioned, the lab practice, or the way we've been approaching social movements in general, over the last period, has been to ask each movement about these connections, like Sandro said, genealogical connections with the historical weight, transversal connections with other movements in a similar space, and international connections. I think with things are so complex in Lebanon and Lebanese politics, I want to start, or it seems to me useful to start, to ask Karim both to give us some idea about the nature of the protest starting in October 2019, the social composition of the protests, the kinds of practices, the specific revolt about WhatsApp, but also try to maybe do this first, to try to give us a context within the historical reality of Lebanon, the resolution of the civil war, the sectarian government, the kinds of issues out of which the protests come. It's already a huge task for you, Karim, but I thought this if you could weave together some of that to give us an idea, because I think most of the viewers are like me and need a lot of help to understand the complexities of the Lebanese situation and the nature of the protests. Karim, you're still muted, I think.
Okay. Hi. I hope you can hear me. And thanks, Michael and Sandro and Redmayne for inviting me to this important conversation. Lebanon, yes. Frankly, I think we're all confused, and I hope I'll be able to shed a little bit of light. But truly, I think we're all confused in Lebanon and trying to figure out what exactly is going on. But the short story here is that in October 2019, after a particularly harsh set of new kind of indirect taxes that were put in place by the Lebanese government, there were some big protests, started small, but then started to grow in this mid-October period, started to grow increasingly until the Beirut city square, the downtown Beirut, was filled with protesters, eventually up to about 150,000, such were the estimates. And more importantly, it also grew outside of Beirut into both the kind of major coastal cities in Tripoli, as well as in some of the more areas in various villages and towns. So it was very important. It was a very big protest movement that effectively were protesting against this very regressive economic and financial situation that had been something that had been building up at least for the previous decade. And maybe it makes sense for me just to categorize maybe 3 or 4 phases that are important in kind of general background. There was a big civil war in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990. This ended with a kind of peace agreement, the so-called Ta'if Accords in 1990. This then ushered in this new phase of reconstruction after the Civil War. What this did effectively is it brought in these militiamen, those that had conducted the war, those that had, in fact, a lot of war criminals and others had effectively been, as part of this agreement, international agreement, had been put in place and became ministers and parliamentarians, and the positions were distributed among many of these kinds of people in order for there to have been this agreement. So the 1990s, politicians were dominated by these sectarian militias who had been put into government. At the same time, there was this extraordinary new set of economic and financial policies that were sort of this larger neoliberal economy that was being produced in Lebanon and took its very particular form inside Lebanon, and which was very interesting. On the one hand, there was a lot of consumption that was produced, so the middle class kind of grew quite a bit. The kind of consumption patterns came, as we now know, extremely unsustainable, but Lebanon and Beirut became an interesting place to be, a lot of fun, great food, great place to be. But at the same time, the inequality had already been beginning to grow. And the kind of policies that had been put in place were quite kind of draconian, but that many people didn't quite know about at the time. So for example, one of the centerpieces of this reconstruction was in the downtown Beirut. And one of the first kind of law decrees that were passed by the prime minister and the cabinet at that point was to dispossess all the small kind of landowners that had owned little plots of land in downtown Beirut, and shops and stores where the marketplace were kind of was really like the heart of downtown Beirut, and they were given shares in the large private company called Solidaire. That was itself the largest shareholder was the prime minister at the time, Rafiq Hariri, with his also kind of Saudi and Gulf investors and others from the diaspora, rich diaspora, had invested in this thing. So overnight, you had this incredible transfer from public and small of it to this large shareholder. And this was the kind of economic policies that were enacted throughout Lebanon. This continued to grow in the 1990s, and a huge amount of money was attracted, kind of capital was being attracted from rich Lebanese diaspora, from the Gulf countries in particular, were coming in and were benefiting from huge interest rates and this kind of real estate and the banking and the financial service kind of sector, and complemented by tourism, which trickled down to a certain extent to the middle classes and even a little bit to lower classes to a certain extent. The next phase of this was that as this started to dry out, money started to dry out, you ended up with a bit of a recession, and this kind of dream many people were having in the 1990s began to disappear, and the kind of cracks began to appear. The sectarian politics started to come back with a vengeance. There was a lot more direct kind of international interventions, including the Israeli war in 2006. International meddling throughout this kind of period. And then you had a kind of a situation where the government kept on spending in order to continue to let's say enrich this kind of clientelist networks that had been building up throughout this period, fund these men that were now running the state and running the government. At that point, all these kinds of public sector areas, from the healthcare to education, etc., were losing so much money that the banks, through the deposits, were giving more and more money, but then they were not recouping this money. The capital was not coming in anymore until we arrived to the kind of recent period where effectively the government ran out of money. Lebanon declared bankruptcy, and the commercial banks started to tell depositors, we don't have your dollars anymore. We don't have any money. The economy had become dollarized, and people overnight were unable to access their money that they had been for all those years. So the state declared bankrupt. The central bank said, we don't have money. The commercial bank said, you can't get any more cash because we don't have it. All of this kind of, all this kind of situation led to these incredible protests that erupted in October 2019 and have been trying in various forms to kind of grow in the intervening period.
Sandro, I had a question before. Sandro will too, I'm sure. But Karim, I was wondering how much of the other protests in the region, how much their aspirations and practices affected and enabled some of the 2019 protests, and how much of it, of the protests starting in 2019, we have to read specifically within a Lebanese context. I mean, you know, the aspirations to democracy that we see, you know, starting in 2011, or the practices of, you know, occupying a building or occupying a square. I mean, how would you judge? Maybe if you could just give some evaluation of the extent to which the residents of other struggles were enabling, and the extent to which things really have to be thought within Lebanon itself.
Right. Well, I think there was at the start, I think there was a lot of so clearly the context, this feeling. I mean, I was one of the people that went out on the streets in these, at least in the early days, in the first couple of weeks. There was a very clear understanding that somehow, in some organic way, this was coming out of protests, out of kind of the kind of larger Arab uprisings, at least the principle of the Arab uprisings that were there. Some of the slogans were coming out of the protests from Egypt and Syria to that extent. There was a feeling of euphoria and a feeling that it was, for once, you know, we're getting beyond this kind of local politics. We're appealing to something much larger, some kind of more regional and universal set of demands that were that had erupted period. But then I think, and the Iraq protests, you know, started to happen around the same time. So the kind of the uprisings in Sudan as well, and several, this kind of wave of uprisings were in this period. So we felt we're sort of part of this larger set of uprisings across the region. I think soon after that, though, maybe a few weeks after that, we begin to read, I think, this uprising or the protests has started to happen in a much more kind of local Lebanese setting. And that's when this kind of, when the sense, frankly, of more, let's say, defeat began to happen, when it became clear that this counter insurgency began to happen, when it became clear that the protests had been infiltrated by sectarian leaders, by the intelligence services within the army, within the security services, with some of the kind of Western and other embassies that operate kind of quite locally inside Beirut, inside Lebanon. As this kind of phase began to kind of push through, I think this idea that we were part of this larger kind of regional protest began to die down, and we sort of went into this very kind of localized feelings, in a sense, and this feeling of helplessness, like you can't defeat the sectarian system. The situation was bigger than we were, you know, that this international regional setting was simply too big for Lebanon and was beyond our control. So of course, some protests continued, and there was still some sort of hope. But the reality is that over the several months, the intervening months until now, so much has happened to kind of lead to a puncture of the aspirations and a lowering of the ceiling quite a bit, to the extent that now it's just like, please, let's just stabilize the country to an extent. Please let me see some of my money. The Lebanese lira, the national currency, has been devalued by 80%, lost 80% of its value. As I said, people can't access their money in the banks. Unemployment is around 50%. Poverty has now reached around 50%. In a country like Lebanon, which was always considered kind of, you know, mid-range, you know, through the UN indices, it was always kind of, you know, mid-range, wasn't considered a poor country. Now, if you think about 50% poverty, especially among the younger generations, and if you consider the number of people that are leaving, we're hemorrhaging. And this is during COVID period. People are leaving as soon as they can. As soon as COVID begins to lessen, there's going to be an even bigger departure of this kind of younger generation. So yes, at the beginning, and then I think it starts to go as a kind of more depressed and negative impressions begin to happen. It's unfortunate that I think we've lost, for the part, the kind of connection, the organic connection with these larger regional and international struggles, which might have given us more hope, you know, that there's something out which has solidarity. We don't feel particularly that there's much solidarity out there, except for for humanitarian reasons. There was on August 4th, there was a massive blast in Beirut, the biggest explosion since World War II, single biggest explosion since World War II, which destroyed the Beirut port. And there was a huge amount of sympathy from all over the world, huge amount of sympathy and aid and personal connections and governmental support and humanitarian. But by then we had reverted to this sense of, we're humanitarian. It's a kind of humanitarian situation rather than, this is the protest and there's political demands. It was, here we are as a humanitarian recipient and recipient of empathy and sympathy rather than of strong political demands. And I think this was a very big turning point for us.
Well, you have described the kind of defeat of the uprising and the ensuing disenchantment. But let's go back to the beginning of the movement. And I think it would be very interesting to dwell a bit more on the composition of the movement, on the demands, but also on the political imagination that was collectively driving people on the streets.
Yes, actually those first, I would say 2 or 3 weeks after October 17, 18, those first 2 or 3 weeks really were euphoric in Beirut and other places. There was a tremendous mix of people that were coming in, and this was a class mix, different from from the wealthy down to the workers, some even migrants and refugees had kind of come in and joined in some of these demonstrations. So there were people from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, people from all over the country that came to Beirut and otherwise protested in different areas. And there was a real sense of solidarity, people from Beirut to Tripoli in Lebanon or to certain villages across the country. There was a sense of, okay, we're networking together. There is a common social understanding and cause that explains all of this. And that is the economic and financial set. So the big rallying theme was the question of corruption, and the sense of just the sheer lack of justice and fairness. It was social justice and fairness by which all of these politicians across the Aryan divide were treating their own constituents and the country as a whole. So there was a resurgence of labor unions, this kind of attempt to, I shouldn't say resurgence, but an attempt to rebuild certain unions had been frankly co-opted. Largely, the big labor unions had been co-opted by the sectarian leaders. So they were not very effective in the post Civil War period. And so there was a sense of, okay, we need to move beyond those kinds of unions. There was 2 or 3 elections, the lawyers union, the engineering, some of the workers, the teachers union, and they threw out some people that came from these rules. It was a really interesting period to say, okay, there was this potential. There is this interesting potential. And I would say for once over the past, in this post kind of Civil War period, the past 2 or 3 decades, I would say for once, these sectarian leaders that had really have a chokehold on them didn't know how to react. There was a sense of they were scared. They were afraid that there was a potential that all these different elements were going to come together and somehow pose an actual challenge, a real challenge, and a proper political challenge. And so it was really interesting time to be there. There was a lot of, as I said, solidarity. There was a lot of, artists coming down to the square, people kind of, providing food, cooking, all of this kind of thing to provide a certain solidarity. And what was interesting in that sense, I think also emblematic about it, was that this downtown Beirut that I mentioned had been controlled effectively by this private company with private security guards and very, very expensive restaurants and cafes and things like this that really only the rich were able to go, and effectively the middle and lower classes basically were not allowed in effect, had been reclaimed. I mean, you would go downtown and there would be people there, and not just going to a restaurant, an expensive restaurant, but actually mixing and meeting and sitting in places that normally the private security guards or the army guys or the kind of parliament security people would allow you to sit, and no, you can't sit here, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. They were there, and they were there morning and night, and they were pitching tents. And so there was something, there was a a kind of revolutionary potential that was there. So and there was a very big sense of, okay, there were marches, women's marches. There was kind of specific neighborhoods that were coming out from the Civil War. I mean, if this kind of Civil War resonance, where a neighborhood that was of a particular kind of sect, let's say, met with another one from another sect, and they kind of came together at a meeting point that used to be the Green Line, where the fighting of the Civil War fighting and the militia fighting used to be. And so there was a lot of this symbolic, the sense of, and people were saying, okay, the Civil War finally is over. I mean, 3 decades later, but the kind of one of the slogans in a sense was that the Civil War finally ended. And we are not through some kind of elite agreement internationally backed by the Americans and the French and the Saudis and the Syrians that imposed a certain structure on top, but in fact from this bottom up, from the people, from the sense of, okay, we need to heal these wounds that had never been healed. We need to learn the history that that frankly people don't know. I mean, there are no history textbooks that are taught in high school. You're not taught the Civil War, so the memory had disappeared. The sense of, okay, we're teaching each other now. Everybody's teaching each other, and so there was this really interesting and euphoric sense of coming together that lasted maybe a month or so, and then started to dissipate.
Thank you very much. I think it is time for Amy and Ruba to jump in. So, Amy, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and Karim for giving us so much to think about. So I'm now in Washington, DC, but I actually spent most of the last decade living in the Middle East, mainly in Egypt, where I was hired in 2008 to actually teach classes on social movements and development at the American University in Cairo. And so my perspective will be, to reflect on the Lebanese uprising from my experiences of living in Egypt, as well as the research that I've conducted in Turkey and Syria and the Kurdish regions, especially in northern Syria, which is known as Rojava. So I guess I first want to say this idea that you were talking about just now, Karim, about the reclaiming downtown Beirut and how that was really a cause for euphoria. Of course, this is a commonality that we saw in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Turkey during the Gezi protests, and all across the region where these public spaces were reclaimed by the people. And that this led, as you put it, I believe, to a kind of, overcoming some of these sectarian divides, and as something that's quite positive, I think, if I understand you correctly. Now, I would actually like to draw parallels to what happened in northern Syria. I mean, so I remember clearly, 2011 in Tahrir Square, it became like a pilgrimage, right? People from all over the world were coming to see Tahrir Square when it was occupied by the people, and the tents and the protests, similar to what happened in Gezi in Turkey in 2013 and elsewhere. And, what happened in northern Syria began in a similar way of reclaiming the space as the Assad regime withdrew from northern Syria in the summer of 2012. And then you had this creation of a semi-autonomous region, which has now extended to include about 1/3 of Syria is under control of the so-called Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. And the Kurds, however, originally this was called as Rojava, or the Rojava Revolution, but as they began to expand into Arab majority areas, as they defeated the Islamic State in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and Manbij, etc., they actually stopped using the term Rojava in order to, I think, show sensitivity towards the Arab majority regions. And so now it's not officially called Rojava anymore, and Rojava is not part of the title of the administration, but Idariya Zatiya Shamal Sharq Suria, the self-administration of Northeast Syria. So they use the Arabic. And so you have a minority in Syria, the Kurds, that have shown this kind of sensitivities towards Arabs and non-Kurds, also the Christian minority in northern Syria, to accommodate them and bring them into this structure of reclaiming space from which the Assad regime has withdrawn. Whereas I'm not sure you have the same level of sensitivity from Arabs, for example, in Egypt, vis-a-vis the non-Arab components of Egypt, toward Nubians, for example. And I would be curious to hear how, your thoughts from Lebanon, but I've advocated for not actually using the term Arab Spring to talk about these uprisings, and that was of course a Western invention. Those were, Western academics that started to call it an Arab Spring, whereas the people, at least in Egypt, were calling it a Thawra, a revolution, back in 2011. But if we as academics use the term Arab Spring, we're actually erasing all of the non-Arabs that have taken part in these very important uprisings. And I think we're doing a disservice. And so that's why I've advocated for not using the term Arab Spring. So that's actually my first point. But the second is that this reclaiming of the space that has happened in Syria in the Gezi protests, when the Kurds did this, there was a very different reaction, and it was seen as threatening. And I think that's, partly related to very deep-seated, anti-Kurdish sentiments in Syria and Turkey and elsewhere in the region. So those would be just my initial comments on your remarks.
Do you want me to intervene
Michael,
now?
how do you want to do this?
I would say, Karim, if you could briefly have some things to say with regard to to Amy's comments, and then proceed to Ruba. It seems like the most,
we keep more the form of a conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think very interesting points. I think I think if I'm thinking about this in the larger picture, and you include Syria, you include certainly Palestine, which Ruba, I think we'll talk about Palestine, include Iraq, you include sort of the Levant, the kind of Mesra area. You're talking about an area that's extremely rich in terms of history and culture and kind of coexistence and different groups that have lived together in ways that are quite unique. And one of the things that all these uprisings tended to claim was the unification of all of this in terms of demands of equality and kind of rendering them into citizenship, for instance, and into saying equal rights and women's rights and all the minority rights, etc. I think this was something that was very much part of the demands, and certainly something that the counter-revolution, this was sort of so-called counter-revolution, tried to squash and deploy division, sectarian or other kinds of class divisions, etc. within these protests. The question of non-Arabs and Arabs, I think, plays a role, but I think there's also a sense among Arabs that the international context has also negates the sense that there was also an Arab world and an Arab area, and I think this is also something that needs to, there's an interesting dynamic that the internationals are kind of move away from sort of divide up the Arab world. There's a sense of that you can't talk in terms of the Arab world. It needs to be divided. And at the same time, within the Arab world, of course, there's a lot of minorities that either are integrated or discriminated against in certain, and you have to add this, of course, even in the context of Lebanon, of course, you have a huge chunk of refugees. We have about 1 million refugees that are in Syria. There is around 400,000 registered Palestinian refugees, of course, that have been, not just since 2011, and since 1948 and sort of onwards. And the way in which Lebanon has integrated the Palestinian refugees to start with was quite a miserable way, and this dispersed into these refugee camps and rather inhumane kind of conditions. Palestinian refugees are not allowed to work in most professions in Lebanon. So there is a particular kind of relationship with constructing the sectarian state on the one hand, and at the other hand, how do you accommodate not just people from outside these kind of large refugee populations, but how that then, more importantly, how that unsettles the sectarian agreement and the kind of the clientelist networks that go into this, and that is what causes certain kinds of conflict. And all of this resolution, and what was interesting about the Lebanese uprising, if this, to go to the more positive side of it, was that it was inclusive. It's a sense of all of this needs to be included, and there was not, there was not a kind of counter. Well, we want to go after the refugees. The refugees are causing all the problems in Lebanon. That had been there in the background, but surprising, or those in the press anywhere, were certainly calling for inclusivity. We're calling for much better a distribution of rights among the refugees and across all the different classes. I think that's quite an interesting phenomenon that happened.
I was just wondering, and maybe Karim, I don't know if there's an easy way to respond to this, but Amy makes me think of it. It seems to me there's a kind of intersection between, let's say, the neoliberal nature of the regime, with the transformation of downtown, et cetera, and then of course the sectarian divisions within the regime. And I guess I was wondering if there's an easy way of thinking of, and maybe not, maybe there's not a close relation between the sectarian divisions of the government and of social relations and the neoliberal developments. Is there a kind of overlay, like that what you would say between the neoliberal and policies and is it maybe within the sectarian government, is each of the different parts of it participate equally in this neoliberalization of society over the last decades, or is it kind of differentiated? I'm not sure if I'm expressing myself quite well, but I think you see what I mean.
No, I think basically the way the Lebanese kind of sectarian system has worked, and that was reinforced in the post-Civil War kind of agreement, the power sharing agreement, let's say, is that it brings together the key sectarian groups and leaders, and they then use the state in agreement. They use the state as a resource to enrich their clientelist networks. So they pay off in their own constituency by using the Lebanese and the public assets and the services, which drains, of course, all of this, and they distribute it in their own kind of private clientelist networks. That's what keeps the sectarian leaders in a kind of power sharing agreement, and that has been quite resilient in that sense. The issue became, and what was interesting about the uprisings, and what was in a sense disappointing that it didn't sustain itself so far, I mean, at least for now, is that there seemed to have been, we were hoping that there would have been, it had reached a point where when the state itself is so bankrupt that it actually declared officially bankrupt, it did not pay back its debtors. And the banks literally closed their doors. You were not allowed to go into the bank and take out your savings, your money, your dollars were not allowed to be taken out. That the system had been disrupted, that it would have been broken, because how are you dealing with your clientelist networks if that money is no longer there? Well, they procured it. They did procure. There is still, turns out, there's still some money that's there. There's still money that does come in, that is able to, but the fact that we lost 80% of the value of our currency means that those groups that do have their dollars, that did steal the dollars and have kept them reserved, it's much cheaper for them now to purchase really cheap, if you have the dollars, wheat and food and gas and stuff like that, and distribute that. So actually it strengthened some of these clientelist networks. And so this is something that's, so the neoliberal state was there to remove, was to privatize, shed all the assets, distribute it within this kind of clientelist networks, which reinforced the sectarian part of the state. It worked to the point where it was in the middle and kind of, certain classes were able to kind of live a dream and consume very well. But when the consumption started to go down, when it became clear that the state was running out of money, and using indirect taxes, really harsh indirect taxes to finance all of this. That's when protests started to happen. That's when people began to understand that this system is not sustainable.
Yeah, that's great. Ruba, sorry, I jumped in, but just because I was interested in that point. Could you jump in now?
Thank you, Michael, Sandro, and everyone, and Karim especially, for this really important conversation that we're having. And I'm very glad to have read your paper prior to the meeting today, because it was really informative. As you know, very few papers are so informative of the recent kind of history. And you do a really good job in really conveying the sense of, with a very sarcastic, ironic attitude, the sense of demise, the sense of hopelessness of the moment in Beirut and in Lebanon, which is, for those of us who weren't in Lebanon in the past few months, I mean, it's something quite new to feel this profound disenchantment, as Sandro was saying. My question actually goes back. I'm very glad you mentioned and you brought in your conversation the issue of refugees, because I think that particularly in Lebanon, the question of refugees begs a very important question. And the reason I'm saying this is that I think Palestinian refugees, as you rightly mentioned, have always been sort of the absent present of the whole history of the country. Not to mention that the Taif agreement in itself is premised on the exclusion of Palestinians. I mean, the idea, the sectarian organization of the country, and the very flawed or problematic performative idea of a Lebanese citizenry, which we've seen didn't work, is premised on the idea that Palestinians are the other and are not allowed constitutionally to settle in the country. So, I mean, they're crucial in the making of the country, but they're always absent in its analysis. So I'm very glad that you actually have brought that in. And my question to you is, obviously we know that there has been a longue durée that was a preparation ground for this uprising of 2019. And more recently, over the years, we've been seeing, demonstrations from, people protesting about the building of a new car park in Hamra, to a lot of everyday resistance against the rising of renting prices in urban Beirut, to protest against corporatization, privatization of public spaces, and so on and so forth. So there have been a longue durée. But I'm interested in the longer longue durée, if you wish. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what happened to that sort of leftist, universalist political culture that was predominant during the civil war. I mean, Palestinians and Lebanese were together fighting against conservative, phalangist, Christian, right-wing constituencies and political movements and parties. Whereas now, in a way, all the discourse and analysis most often still reproduce a notion where the problem of the country, of course, is sectarianism. And if only we could have sort of a more balanced, a less corrupt system. But still, I mean, that tradition of intersectional, internationalist, leftist political culture that was actually the reason why Palestinians in the first place were kicked out of the country, basically, because they constituted a threat to the powers that be, that didn't want it, that were preparing the ground for becoming this neoliberal system and political apparatus. So I'm wondering what has been recuperated of that tradition in the current uprising, if anything, and whether you don't think this is actually part of the problem, because as you mentioned also in your paper, the main language that's been mobilized, and I know, I mean, a lot of my friends are also in the movement of Beirut Madinati and the language of citizenship and the claiming of rights and equality, is also what was characteristic of the Egyptian revolution in many ways. But that's also what part of the problem, because in a way, I mean, we have, for example, now in Egypt, a situation where the racism, sheer racism towards, for example, the Palestinian refugee population is rising. in parallel to the rising of a social movement that obviously has been shattered in the last few years. But so basically, my question to you is, what do you think has happened to that political culture? Whether there is hope that it can be brought back, that we can expand beyond this notion of citizenship and equal rights, which is still highly exclusionary and can become even more exclusionary, as we've seen in recent times. And I would just conclude by saying that one of the risks of this is that we've seen sort of the normalization of relationships between various Arab countries and Israel, which went down actually quite well with the people. I mean, we are used to think that, the people will always resist this. I was really struck by a video that was circulating recently on the social media that was actually taken by an Israeli, I think from the accent, in Dubai. And he goes around the supermarkets showing how the supermarkets of Dubai are invaded by Israeli products and flags with people who are completely at ease with it. So basically, my point is that I would like to know a little bit more about these 2-3 issues, and what are your thoughts with regard to the question of normalizations of relationships with Israel in the context of these failed uprisings and attempts of seeking justice.
You ask really incredible questions that Michael will kill me because it might take me an hour to respond to. But there really are crucial questions. Maybe let me get to sort of 2 points that I think that not exactly the same, but one is the question of the refugees. I mean, it's interesting. Yes, Lebanon, and obviously during the Civil War and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, had kind of defined itself within the Palestine question, in a sense. Refugees posed to the right-wing conservative kind of Christian establishment, it posed this kind of existential threat. And so that's why put them in the ghettos, put them in the refugee camps, and deny them rights. They're not allowed to join, they're not allowed to basically to work in any of the professions, all of which have their unions and all of which exclude Palestinians in these kinds of unions. What's interesting, or what's happened, I think, after the Syria war, is that the kind of Palestine question has been pushed to the side. The Palestine refugee question pushed a little bit to the side. And it's obviously, for reasons of sheer bulk, became all about the Syrian refugee. And the sense of there's over, at one point, there are estimates about 1.5 million. We're talking about a Lebanese population of, 4.5, 5 million. So there's at one point, 15, 20% or more of the population were refugees. And the sense of this is an existential threat to Lebanon. There was certainly a backlash in some sectors, and the kind of racism that happens, in these kinds of circumstances, and some of it pretty nasty. If you went to certain villages across Lebanon, you would find signs that, you can still see them in some places. It's signs that say no Syrians allowed out. Of course, these are class issues, right? These are Syrians that are, these are lower. This is not the middle or upper class Syrians. These are the ones that are lower class, the workers. No Syrians allowed out at night between this hour and that. This is pre-COVID. This is like, a few years ago. There were actual signs. Syrian workers are not allowed out at night. So this kind of situation was quite prevalent, and the sense of this overwhelming sense of refugees that were coming, that were going to redefine what it meant to be Lebanese, was seized upon by kind of the right-wing groups among the different sects, I would say, because the Syrian refugees were distributed across the country in different ways, and were not, unlike the Palestinians, were not put in refugee camps. So they were dispersed into urban areas and into village areas, and kind of put in certain places, and were funded by some of them that were registered. UNHCR were given handouts, were given money, so there was a lot of racism on the one hand, a lot of resentment on the other hand, a sense that, okay, how long are they going to be here? And frankly speaking, there's a sense in Lebanon, in Beirut, that people are thinking, these guys are never going to leave. Why would they leave? The situation in Syria is much worse than here. It's going to be much worse for a long time. Why would they leave? I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying there is this sense that the refugees are here and they're going to be here for the immediate future anyway, in the imagination. This is going to pose a huge challenge as the situation gets worse and worse economically, and things are going to get worse. After the new year, things are going to get even worse in Lebanon, as subsidies, the kind of basic subsidies of food and gas and oil and stuff like this, as that starts to disappear, the situation will get even worse in Lebanon. And usually that's going to prompt, looking at the more vulnerable and kind of going on. This is something that we haven't really hit yet, and I think it's going to be happening. So it's something to look out for. It's something where, kind of to go to your question, it's really interesting. I agree with you 100%. The kind of leftist tradition, or the leftist current that was there during the Civil War, frankly, became quite marginal after the war. The sheer strength of the kind of government, the post-war governments that came out, the sheer sense of they were all these sectarian leaders kind of unified with a new class of bankers and kind of businessmen and the kind of expatriates that were sending huge amounts of money, that were pouring in money, and a dollarized economy where the purchasing power was very strong because of the dollarized economy that was being funded and funded and funded, as we know, and there was no more money, but for that period, made this kind of sense of being left, really pushed it to the margin. Because why, things are great. What's the problem? Why would there be a left in that sense? Outside of the kind of the traditional communist, small kind of communist party and certain leftist groups. There was, in the uprisings, there were several kind of leftists, the Communist Party did participate, and they can still mobilize people, in their own kind of way. There was a couple of other leftist groups, by people like Sharb al-Nahas and others that tried to mobilize and they clashed a lot with these more liberal groups like Beirut Medinity, like other kinds of groups that tried to say, no, this has to be bottom up. There are no leaders. We don't want to participate in politics. We want all these government people to go. We want the end of corruption. We're not participating. We're just going to be protesting. These guys were saying, on the other hand, no, we need to engage in politics. We need to be there. We need to step into these positions and fight within the state itself, because this is not a revolution in the sense you're not cutting off any king's head here. You need to seize power, and you need to say, this is our agenda, and we need to form political parties. It's striking that to this day, not a single political party was formed. Among those, there's about 200 to 400 groups, depending how you count them, that came from the uprising. And there's still those groups that have not unified. They've not formed a single political party. The only person that formed a political party was this kind of more leftist party that had been formed a couple of years before that by Sharb al-Nahas and others, and who are claiming we need to engage in politics. Stop saying, we want corruption to end or we want citizenship. You cannot, because that system does not allow it. You have to change that system because that system will never accommodate it. So there is this clash, and the more liberal elements of this have the sense that they succeeded meant that, for me, it meant that the larger movement in the short term kind of failed. There was not an engagement with politics in the sense of we need to go into politics and we need to take it over based on our agenda, rather than say, we just don't recognize those ministers, we don't recognize the parliament, they're all corrupt and we want our money back, kind of thing, and we want independent judiciary. Well, who's going to give you an independent judiciary? You're asking these people to give you an independent judiciary. It's contradictory. It won't work. And that's the situation we're in now. The best case scenario for this is the sense of, okay, well then we've lost this moment. So let's start again, building within the labor movements, within certain social movements. Let's build it up. So when the opportunity shows up again, it's been built up in a kind of grassroots level. To what extent that'll happen? I think it's going to be very, very difficult. The kind of, yeah, sorry, Michael, I've gone on maybe a bit too much here.
No, that's good. Why don't I think Amy had one other another direction to take us, and then why don't you go ahead, Amy?
Sure. So I think we don't have a lot of time. I just want to maybe ask a bit of a provocative question. To what extent do you think it's possible, Karim? I mean, you were discussing how the economic crisis and the inability to pay the different clientelistic networks, and kind of a breakdown of the state functioning, the functioning of the Lebanese state. If we compare this again to what used to be called Rojava, or now Shemal Sharq Syria in Syria, where they have 1/3 of Syria, they have their own military, they have their Asayish police forces, they have their own schools, their own courts, which function, and they are not, they're not separatists, they're not trying to separate from Damascus, but they're trying to create their own local government. And so I would pose a question: to what extent should we think of Lebanon as a de facto non-state, but Rojava or Northeast Syria as a de facto state that does not have recognition? So Lebanon has international recognition as a state, but de facto, it's no longer a unified state. Whereas Northeast Syria de facto has a state at the local level, but nobody recognizes it, and nobody that the internet was good enough that you could get my question.
Yeah, I think I did. It's interesting that it's the person in the United States whose internet is not working. Yes, the question of the Lebanese state. I prefer to think about it in a different way. I prefer to think about it in the sense of I'm against this kind of parceling out and dividing up all these countries. I think that's the wrong approach. I think there needs to be states that are built around a kind of more inclusive identity that includes all this. The Kurdish situation, you know much better than me. So, but there's also a sense of exclusion of some of the Arab populations that are there as well. So I don't think that the solution in Syria is to divide up along ethnic lines. I don't think the solution in Lebanon, as some of the traditionally the Christian right-wing movements have often said, they've used the euphemism of let's federalize Lebanon. That's a kind of euphemism of dividing up basically along sectarian lines and give so much autonomy, as you're saying, in this kind of Kurdish sense of autonomy, that they tax their own areas, they do their own things, but it's still within a kind of nominal Lebanese entity. I don't think this is the way forward. I think that's a kind of Israeli model. I think it's this kind of ethno-nationalism, which itself will create more problems, in the future. I think kind of one of the missing elements in the discussion, in fact, is this Israeli model. It's a model that has come into this region where the entities were, even the Lebanese sectarian system, and I mean, there are people have written about this, obviously, but even in the Lebanese sectarian system, where these were attempts to include different groups together for all of its problems, obvious problems, whereas there are other models that have been introduced, including the Saudi kind of Gulf model into this region, that are based on more exclusionary visions or exclusionary senses of politics and who should be included in these areas. I think we need to be resisting all of this.
Well, I just want to jump in and say they are not actually excluding Arabs. That's why they even dropped the name Rojava. They don't even use that to be sensitive to the Arabs. I mean, and to be sensitive to the fact that the majority of people now in that area are Arabs. So it is not a Kurdish region anymore, and it's not a Kurdish separatist project. And that's one of the major misunderstandings that I'm just trying to point out, that the Kurds showed this level of sensitivity to the Arabs. They don't even call it Rojava anymore, and they are including them in this local government. So the question was more about the governance, the functioning of a local government, not ethnic exclusion. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, based on what you're saying, as I said, you know the details there more than me, but so based on what you're saying, I still think that this idea of having a state or an area that's de facto kind of, in the Lebanese model, let's say the equivalent would be to have a certain area in Lebanon that's controlled by a kind of, Christian entity that allows for non-Christians or whatever to exist and to kind of coexist in a certain way, but with a certain relationship of power. That's normally the way these things would end up, and that was the right-wing Christian vision inside Lebanon. That was the idea behind it, and that is what the kind of leftists and the nationalists, with the Palestinians and others, kind of were disputing. That is part of the reason you ended up in a civil war in Lebanon in the first place. I think building around rebuilding societies and these countries in a way that allows inclusivity is hugely important, because I do believe, and again, this is something I was trying we weren't able to introduce, and Ruba kind of, talked about a little bit, but there is this international dimension that we haven't gotten into, I think, very much, and it's very important. There is a long history of international intervention in this region, and maybe more than any other region. It's been over 100 years of non-stop interventions, with the goal to divide up these areas. Endless division. I mean, Palestine was lost. The question of South Lebanon, for instance, is still very much part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The idea of what Hezbollah is or isn't in the kind of international debates is a very interesting one. But South Lebanon, where Hezbollah kind of dominates, is very much connected to the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not, whereas it's become cast purely in the question of, oh, the weakness of the Lebanese state or not the weakness of the Lebanese state. I mean, both of these are happening at the same time. Ruba had asked earlier about the question of normalization, which is a really interesting question. My only pushback to that is that I do not believe that the vast majority in the Middle East, or the Arab world anyway, support that. I think the Dubai situation, the United Arab Emirates, is very, very particular with a very small population that's, let's just say it's very top down. And I don't think it represents what most people in the region support. And it's not, I don't think it's a surprise that it's more the authoritarian regimes that are kind of pushing ahead with this, with very immediate and transactional reasons. The Sudanese accepted it. It's a military government that accepted it in return for being taken off the so-called terrorist list of the Americans. The Moroccans were given the Western Sahara as a, not given, but the kind of Trump and the United States recognized it. It doesn't become it, but the American kind of recognized this. So each of these entities, the United Arab Emirates, got these incredible arms that are coming in. So each one of these countries got something very material and very specific in return for this kind of recognition. I don't think that most people support this. I really don't. In Morocco, I think there's going to be a lot of pushback to this. As I said, the United Arab Emirates is a very particular model, a very particular example, which I don't think is exemplary. But I do think we have moved to a different stage in this larger Arab-Israeli conflict. The idea of open normalization is something that's new. And so some of the social movements that are coming out have to grapple with this larger regional shift. They simply have to. In Lebanon, it's become clear that now there's a government that's trying to be formed. There's no government now. There's a caretaker government. A new government is supposed to be formed. But everybody around will tell you, hey, it's not going to be formed until the United States green lights it. And so far, the Americans are putting huge sanctions in Lebanon and Syria as well, of course, and Iran. But Lebanon, as far as the Trump administration is concerned, is a kind of extension of Iran because of Hezbollah. So there are sanctions, and they will not allow a government to be formed because somehow they think that will benefit Hezbollah, as kind of some kind of stability would benefit Hezbollah. So these kinds of dimensions are there, and they're not going to go away in the coming months or years.
I guess, can I just make one final comment, or we need to end now, Michael?
Go ahead, please, Amy.
Okay. No, I think, I think you're right. The event that I was just on before this one about, Kurds in the Biden administration, one of the other panelists was speaking about how Turkey is actually creating Gazas inside, in multiple parts of the Middle East. In Afrin, for example, Ras Al Ain and Serikani. I mean, this is how he presented it. And, Lebanon and Beirut, you have many of the international media are based right in Beirut, and they base themselves there in order to report about the other countries, partly because you have higher levels of academic freedom, freedom of the press, which we do not have in Egypt, for example. And what these Turkish occupations in Afrin and Ras Al Ain, Serikani, to my knowledge, not a single major media outlet has visited those areas. And so it's really incredibly peripheral. And so I think there's a lack of understanding and a lack of reporting about what's happening because there's simply no international media that even are allowed to go there. And I actually believe that the Kurdish-Turkish conflict, if you want to call it that, or the Kurdish conflict, will be to the 21st century what the Arab-Israeli conflict was to the 20th.
Yeah, Michael, can I just say something? I think the role of Turkey is incredible now. Even in the question of Lebanon, the question of the Kurds, there's an obvious history and an obvious conflict that's there. They have now entered Lebanon over the past year during this protest and over the past year. They've entered quite forcefully in the north of Lebanon. they're putting in a lot of money. If you go to parts of Tripoli in the north, you will find huge posters of Erdogan and others. Yeah. They're funding, they're sending people in, and they're trying to create a certain situation in Lebanon, which is potentially, adds yet another dimension. Because on the other side of that, you have the United Arab Emirates that are against Turkey, and they're kind of pushing through. And so there's this game going on inside Lebanon as well, on top of everything else. So the kind of Turkish role in the region has expanded hugely during the Arab uprisings, insofar as they kind of felt, and Erdogan in particular felt that, hey, it's our natural role as kind of so-called moderate Muslims that also operate with a neoliberal economy, that we're negotiating with the Europeans, with this kind of neo-Ottomanism kind of thing, that we should have a kind of big influence in all these Arab countries through the Muslim Brotherhood. So we have our local, our political parties that we, and funded by the Qataris. This was the kind of part of the regional shift that was happening in the uprisings. And that's which the Saudis and the Emiratis kind of did a counter-revolution against. And so this kind of Emirati, Saudi versus Turkish Qatari thing is in full flow. And that's the reason Qatar is under siege, so to speak, a kind of siege by the other Gulf countries. And this is even now in this last year is playing out in Lebanon. This is separate from the Iran-Saudi Arabia kind of situation as well. So, in Lebanon, this is the idea, saying, okay, you're protesting, you're coming out, and then you look and you see there's the Turkish, Emirati, Saudi game, and then there's the Iranian-Saudi situation. You have the American sanctions, you have the Israelis pushing in every single day. The Israelis fly over every single day. Their presence is felt at every single level. There's a fear now there's a big fear in Lebanon that between now and the time Trump leaves, that in line with the assassinations and things that are happening in Iran, something will happen in Lebanon before Trump leaves. So being in the middle of all of these international and regional intrigues produces the sense in Lebanon of it's just too big. The situation is too big, which is a situation many Lebanese tend to fall into anyway, that the situation is just too big for us. And we need to wait for these moments, these big international moments to kind of move off, and then we can work and kind of build up a little bit more in the months and years to come. That's the hope that we would have.
Well, that might be a place to stop, even though we've had so much more to talk about. I'm really grateful to Karim. So Karim Makdisi in Beirut, Ruba, Salih in London, Amy Holmes in Washington, D.C. I mean, all three of you have made it approachable, something that a situation both in Lebanon and in the region that's so complex, it's difficult to understand. As Amy pointed out, not only in northern Syria, but I think in other places too, the kinds of media attention and understanding that I get is not is difficult to be able to understand it. So I'm really grateful for a conversation with the three of you. And there is so much to say about these things. It's hard to go more. So maybe then we should just stop for now. I just wanted to report once again that that our next Social Movements Lab conversation is going to be the 14th of January, a Thursday, again, the same time, which is 12 noon to 1 East Coast US time. And it'll be about contemporary struggles in schools and universities. The Maddalena Franito in Italy is going to be a primary interlocutor. Heather Gottney in the US is also going to participate in it to talk about contemporary struggles during COVID around schools and universities. Yeah, so thanks everyone for today, and thanks Sandro, and I'll look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.